Okay, today we're going to be studying chapter 16, which has to do with the evidence for evolution. Here are your driving questions. How does the fossil record reveal information about evolutionary changes? What features make the Tiktaalik a transitional fossil, and what role do these types of fossils play in the fossil record? And what can anatomy and DNA reveal about evolution? One of the most important evidence for evolution is the fossil record. Scientists who study these fossils or the fossil record are called paleontologists. So, what is a fossil? A fossils are preserved remains or impressions of once living organisms. All the fossils that make up um, all the different fossils that we've collected over the course of time and the assemblages of these fossils and how they're ordered according to their age is called the fossil record. And again, this is a huge piece of evidence that life has changed over time and therefore species have changed over time. So, how do fossils form? Well, not everything um, dies and forms a fossil. It has to be under very, very special circumstances. So, here's kind of a flow chart on how it happens. Um, in order to become a fossil, you need to basically lie down in the sediment. And if you don't die in the sediment, then basically you are getting eaten up by microorganisms such as bacteria and things like that. But if you do lie down into the sediment when you die, or you get preserved in some manner, such as like freezing, or maybe even getting um, trapped in tree sap, those will preserve you and it'll cause organisms to mineralize or become an imprint. So, reading the fossil record, well, this is a very important um, piece of information because it's evidence of evolution. So, reading the fossil record has to do with mainly the evolution of vertebrates or animals with bony or backbones. The Tiktaalik is a very important piece of information because it shows how there was a transition between fish and land dwelling animals. This shows also, when you read the fossil record, what's called the descent with modification. So, in other words, all living things are related and different species emerge over time due to natural selection. Going back to the fossil record, not all organisms are preserved, so therefore this makes the fossil record incomplete. However, it's extensive enough to show how things are related, and we can kind of put together the pieces where there's gaps. Again, what we do have is it shows an order of succession of evolution. Again, the idea of descent with modification, where you can see changes over time which originated from a common ancestor. This down here shows the family tree of horses, not a family tree, but lines of descendants of fossilized um, ancient horses, if you will. And it just shows a pattern how these things have evolved over the course of time. Again, the Tiktaalik is important because it's an intermediate fossil, and it was a fossil that we believe was found, or not found, but formed 375 to 380 million years ago. And this is important because no land dwelling vertebrates existed during this time, and the Tiktaalik was a intermediate species, where species started out in the water, they think, and then evolved out of the water onto land. So, how are fossils dated? So, that 375 to 380 million years, well, there's a way that they date those. So, fossils are at least as old as the rocks they're encased in, and some types of rocks can be dated directly using what's called radiometric dating. So, this just shows the layering effect. The deeper that you go, like down here, fossil C is going to be older than fossil A because it's higher up. And again, remember, sedimentation happens from the bottom to the top. As we go through time, sedimentation, the layering um, gets layered down, and then over time, these layers build and build and build, and we can find fossils in these layers, and that's how we can kind of determine their date based on the layer that they're in. This is called relative dating, and again, it's used to determine the age of fossils from its position relative to the layers of the rocks or fossils of the known age. So going back to this, we know that these fossils in fossil C are older than fossils B and fossils A because of their relative position. Deeper down equals older in age. Radiometric dating uses radioactive isotopes such as uranium or plutonium or even carbon 14. These are all radioactive isotopes that have specific half lives, and based on the amount in a sample, we can determine how old it is um, based on that radiometric dating. This gives you a little bit more of an accurate measurement of age rather than the relative dating. So going forward, between 4 million and 350 million years ago, most land submerged underwater. This is basically the age of fishes. Some plants and invertebrates started migrating onto land, and again, an invertebrate is an animal without a backbone. Over time, land became more available, so therefore more animals started to emerge from the water and evolved onto land. So, what did land require? Um, it required a sturdier structure, so therefore bones started to evolve. Prevention of water loss, a different way to take in oxygen, and then you needed a way to move around, which were your limbs instead of fins. A tetrapod is a type of vertebrate with four true limbs, and they're jointed, and they have bony appendages with digits. Digits means they have fingers and toes. So this is an example of a tetrapod. One of its limbs, it's bony and it's jointed, and then it has these little digits as appendages. This would enable an animal to move around on land rather than in the water. A Tiktaalik possessed many of these features, um, although it had it was lobe-finned fish, um, which means it had fins instead of fingers. However, you could see that it had joints here, an elbow, and a wrist, and it also had these finger-like bones, even though they looked kind of like fins. Here's kind of the progression of a tetrapod. The Tiktaalik possesses adaptations of both fish and tetrapods. Again, so this is an interesting um, intermediary step to what we know of today. So it's got fish-like traits and it's got tetrapod-like traits. Here, all the differences here or here are all the similarities and differences. Um, and again, it's important because it links the fish-like structure to a tetrapod, which we knew are the beginnings of life emerging onto land. All tetrapods share the same forelimb bones and arranged in the similar order. So the way we look at that is called homology, and its similarities due to common ancestry. And what we do is we look at homologous structures. Homologous structures are those that are similar because they are inherited from a common ancestor. However, they might be for different purposes. Here's an example of that. So fish, you have the fins, and then you have the lobe fins, which again are fin-like features, but then they have these little joints. Here's your Tiktaalik, which have finned and lobe finned, and it's kind of progressing more and more. Then you have amphibians, you have reptiles, you have birds, and then you have us, which are mammals. Here are all the different colors, which represent the different types of bones. And as you can see, they share similarities across evolutionary history. This means that we all came from a common ancestor because of descent with modification. Homology, we also look at early development, and similar embryo structures exist. So how embryos formed, we can take a look at those, and we all know that vertebrates share a common ancestor, therefore we're all related. So taking a look at some vertebrates, we have humans, we have cats, we have fish, we have snakes, and we have chickens. And as you can see here, the closer they are, the closer they're related based on a common ancestor, the more likely they're going to develop as embryos similarly. So human and cats, they look very, very similar. Snakes don't look that similar, but chickens and cats and humans look somewhat similar. Fish doesn't look like anything. So we can say here that fish probably evolved first, then snakes, then birds, and then our mammals, which are humans and cats. Vestigial structure is another piece of evidence of our evolutionary past, and what they are they are structures that no longer serve a clear function. So the example the book uses is a snake embryo has limb buds, which implies that snakes in their evolutionary past had legs, arms, and feet. However, we know snakes today do not use legs. They kind of slither around the ground without legs and arms, but they have limb buds, which implies that they evolved with um, legs and arms, but then they um, evolved without them over time. Humans, if you take a look at us, we have vestigial structures as well. There's two. We have a tailbone because that's remnants of a tail that our common ancestor had, and also we have appendix. Appendix is an organ off of our large intestine that came from our evolutionary past that our ancestors used back in our evolutionary time when they were eating things that were less processed than what we eat today. Another thing that we have been able to do now with technology is sequencing DNA. And the closer they're related, the closer that their DNA will match. So taking a look down here, if we take a look at species A and we have close relative, it only has 3 bases that are different, whereas a distant relative has 5 bases. So the more differences, the more distant the relative is. And this just says that same thing. We know that chimpanzee is our closest um, in our relative uh, in our evolutionary past with a common ancestor. We didn't evolve from chimpanzees. We have a common ancestor. So that's kind of a misconception where we evolved from chimpanzees. No, we have a common ancestor. The chimp went in one direction, humans went in another direction based on natural selection. As we go down this, called a cladogram, down here we share a common ancestor with mice, and down here we share a common ancestor with pufferfish. But as you can see, down here, these guys have 65% of our DNA sequence. Mice have 85% of our DNA sequence. Chimpanzees have 99% of our DNA sequence. So chimpanzees are the closest relative, mice are next, and then pufferfish are way down. So going back to the fossil record is an excellent source of evidence of evolution, seeing how these species have evolved over time. So in summary, evolution, which is descent with modification, all living things are related. They share a common ancestor species and are the result of natural selection operating over millions of years. Evolution is supported by a wealth of evidence, including fossil, anatomical, and DNA evidence. Fossils are preserved remains or impressions of once living organisms that provide a record of past life on Earth. Fossils can be dated directly or indirectly, directly using radiometric dating, indirectly using relative dating. Descent with modification also predicts the existence of intermediate organisms, and homology, which is anatomical, developmental, or genetic similarities shared among groups of related organisms. And lastly, DNA can be used as a molecular clock.